Yeah, so very little anti-Americanism in Iran. In fact, very widely, including, I would say, 70-80% of people in the regime recognize that the anti-Americanism is foolish. Iran should have diplomatic relations with the US. It should stop wanting to be anti-American country. And I think that's almost a consensus. Notice, I didn't say any others of people. I said in the regime. I think if you polled the cabinet of Masoud Pezeshkian today, the Iranian cabinet, I'll make a big claim. I think if you really polled them, like, do you think Iran should have diplomatic relationship with the United States? I think more than 90% and perhaps 100% would say yes, right? This is really what we're talking about. So this anti-American policy is driven forward by Khamenei. This is a key thing, because Khamenei is a true revolutionary of the 79 ideas. He doesn't want Iran to be successful and stuff. When you're revolutionary, your point isn't that people should, have good lives, right? It's that you should achieve some big goals, right? You should make a new man, right? So that's Khamenei. He wants a new man. It's like his open contempt for people's livelihoods. Like the very idea that people would prioritize their own well-being is something that's alien to him, right? So that's what's made sure that anti-American policy has survived. Very little press in Iranian society.
This is Rhyming Chaos, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval, tyranny, or authoritarian takeover.
We hope these interviews can help us understand what's happening in the United States right now and how decent people can fight against it. Today, we're really happy to be speaking to Arash Azizi. He's a writer and a historian who grew up in Iran and moved to Canada to study in 2008. Now he lives in the US. His commentary appears regularly in major publications like the New York Times, and he's a contributing writer at The Atlantic.
His first book, The Shadow Commander, is about Qassem Soleimani, who was one of the most powerful men in Iran and the head of the country's elite Quds Force until he was killed by a US drone strike near Baghdad International Airport on January 3, 2020, in the last days of Trump's first presidency. Soleimani was known as the Shadow Commander, said to have enacted the wishes of the country's supreme leader across the Middle East, establishing the Islamic Republic as a major force in the region, supporting the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, and others.
Arash's second book, What Iranians Want, Women, Life, Freedom, is an account of the uprising that began after a young woman, Mahsa Amini, died under suspicious circumstances after she was arrested by the Guidance Patrol or Morality Police for allegedly not wearing the hijab in accordance with government standards. Welcome, Arash. It's wonderful to have you with us.
It's great to be with you.
Welcome, Arash. I'd like to start with a brief introduction to Iran, and I'm going to do something a bit ridiculous that we sometimes do at the beginning of the show and try and introduce the country in just a minute or two. Iran is often in the news in the United States and globally. It is also profoundly misunderstood, even by Westerners who are well educated. I've met many college-educated Americans who don't seem to know that Iran is not actually an Arab country, which is perhaps one of the most basic facts one needs to know. So if I may be permitted a ridiculous attempt to summarize Iran's history, Iran or Persia has a history dating back more than 2,500 years, beginning with the Achaemenid Empire founded by Cyrus the Great, which stretched from India to Greece. It was known for tolerance of local customs and religions, including the native religion Zoroastrianism. Alexander the Great, the Macedonian warrior, conquered it in 330 BCE, and it was ruled by a variety of empires until it was conquered by Arabs and mostly converted to Islam. From 1925, Reza Shah Pahlavi took over as monarch and began modernizing the country, officially renaming it Iran in 1935. His son continued westernization, but faced growing opposition because of corruption and other reasons until the 1979 Islamic Revolution, led by Ayatollah Khamenei, who overthrew the monarchy and established the Islamic Republic of Iran. Since then, the country has been run as a theocracy. Is that about right, Arash? And what else should we know?
Well, as you said, it's a big country with a large history. So yeah, that's not a bad introduction.
Okay, so let's go straight into life today. Maria and I have both spent a lot of time in China, and it's a country that is also quite misunderstood outside. And often people tend to think it's an autocratic regime, so, there's no space for daily life. And people kind of have this idea of 1984 when they think of China, and it's not really like that. And I suspect Iran might be similar. How would you characterize daily life for Iranians right now? And I'm thinking of just ordinary people, not activists or writers.
Well, Iran is a country which is really not going through a good time. And it's interesting that you mentioned our thousands years history. Iranians actually do often think of themselves in sort of long historical terms. No matter how you look at it, Iran is not doing very well in many ways. One measure of that is that if you ask most Iranians 20 years ago, most Iranians, regardless of their political persuasion, 20 years ago, where do you want to see your country in 20 years? They wouldn't imagine it here. So one of the main factors that make life difficult for Iranians, first of all, of course, they live under a very repressive government that represses, not just a political expression. That's something that happens in many parts of the world, in most of the Middle East, but even the most basic facets of daily life. So most importantly, women, of course, are forced to cover their hair, something that they've really fought against. And now you could say it's a rule that is not really being enforced as much anymore. So it's a huge achievement of women, but the rule is still there. And basics of life, what music you listen to, what games you play, all of this are repressed by a government that has this goal to have a sort of Puritan Islamist society. The other problems, of course, is a lack of economic outlook, which is really linked to Iran's foreign policy, which overall brings a lot of uncertainty to Iranians. So Iran has had a very unusual foreign policy, you could say unique in the world for the past 40 years or so, certainly the last 20 years or so, which basically has adopted for itself the goal of fighting the United States, not just opposing the United States like China does or other places, but fighting the United States because it's this evil Western country that stands for what is wrong with the world, and also trying to destroy Israel. So these twin goals of the Iranian foreign policy, twin declared goals of the foreign policy, coupled with Iran's nuclear program, which has been aggressive and subject of dispute in its relationship with the West, has meant that Iran has spent a couple of decades now under really backbreaking economic sanctions and military threats, which finally resulted in a 12-day war with Israel earlier this year. And the upshot to all of this is that an average Iranian lives in, under a socially repressive condition, international isolation, and economic pressure, really, and a lack of economic foresight. Now, of course, there are always places where things are worse. Iran is still sort of a middle-income country. Iranians are very advanced in many different fields. When you talk to people in Iran, it's not like they're just endlessly crying. But it is true that they do feel like, especially the younger generations, and by young, I mean anybody younger than me, so I'm 37, so, a very expansive definition of young. They don't feel like these are good times for them. And I think the reasons are clear in what I just said.
Yeah, thank you so much, Arash. So I imagine you're in touch with many friends, relatives, and other people in Iran. So if you're able to describe kind of from what you're hearing from them these days, especially after this war with Israel and the economic hardship getting a lot more intense and the crackdown getting harsher as well, what is their daily life like? Like, for example, do people still have regular jobs they go to and then they kind of come home and just try to be staying out of politics? Or are some people still protesting or organizing? I'm sure your friends are also activists and those who are more outspoken. So are they still finding ways to actually speak out, or are they kind of just keeping low profile entirely and just surviving every day or trying to flee the country?
Activism has never stopped, in Iranian history, really. So yes, there are people who organize workers' protests. There are people who are organizing, getting their demands up to journalists. There are people who are speaking out in favor of retirees. And so activism and protest is something that is a constant in Iran. Sometimes it shows itself as mass anti-government sort of demonstrations, which we had in several times in the past few years. And, that's not on the cards, really. But yeah, so activism goes on. As for people's daily lives, well, during the war, of course, it was terrible. After a while, actually, one of the things that happens and now a lot is all these videos of people going back to work. Usually maybe a workplace need to be repaired, maybe a remote period ended, and life goes on. Of course, there's a lot of worries as to, when is the next strike coming, whether there will be a war again, whether there will be a deal. Iran is very much in a limbo. I mean, it's very much in a limbo because President Trump has basically given her a serious offer from the beginning of this year that, we'll either you agree to us or we'll attack you. And there has been negotiations. There were attacks, obviously, leading to a 12-day war. And since then, there are some negotiations, there are some attempts at negotiations. The most important thing here, Maria, to realize is that Iranians feel like the decisions that affect their lives are not taken by them. That's the important thing. They're taken by people in Washington, people in Israel, and also people in the leadership echelons of the government. So, which is going through its own changes and its own challenges and its own turmoil, if you will. But at any rate, to be an average Iranian citizen, it's to feel very despondent because these very big decisions are not taken by you or anybody you elected. And yet that's what determines your life.
Arash, I know it's ridiculous to ask about the average citizen, particularly in a place where you can't actually do any kind of surveys, realistic surveys, but is there still a level of support amongst the average person for the government, for the supreme leader? What's the sense of popular support for current policies?
I think for the supreme leader and for the Islamic Republic as a whole, there's very low level public support. I would put it at 10 to 15%. Some of it is very organized, but 10 to 15%. Policies, I would say there's a slightly more, maybe like 5% more or something, who support some of the policies of the regime on a sort of a nationalist basis almost, or on some sort of a strategic basis. They like that Iran wants to fight Israel. They'll think Iran should be even more aggressive in its nuclear program. In fact, a lot of times they're not a big fan of the anti-Israel policy because they think, we shouldn't help Palestinians per se, but, we should have a nuclear weapon and all that. So, in this sense, they will support some aggressive anti-Western sort of foreign policies. But they're all, I think, in minority. And this is actually important because there is a lot of conversations in the Western media, sort of DC pundits. There's a lot of claims, for example, that, oh no, after the war, now Iranians really support their government and there's a new support for its sort of maximalist foreign policy goals or aggressive foreign policy goals. But no evidence that I have shows that.
You wrote that's been very well acclaimed and widely read, What Iranians Want, Women, Life, Freedom. And you write in the book that, and in other pieces, about the importance of women in Iran's resistance movement. Of course, the 2022 uprising was sparked by the death of the 22-year-old Mahsa Amini after her detention for allegedly not wearing a hijab. But the mainstream mistreatment story of Iranian women by the regime is multifaceted and systematic, especially by the legal system. I was startled to learn from your writings that Iranian women are not allowed to ride a bicycle. Is that right?
That's right. There's a myriad of really bizarre restrictions on Iranian women, and not riding a bicycle is one of them.
And in one of the quotes, I think it was in the interview you did recently with New Statesman, you say women of Iran have presented their films at Cannes film festivals, and yet in their own country, they have to fight for the right to ride a bicycle. I thought the quote was just incredibly striking, just the idea of recognition, freedom, creativity that's out there when they're present in the West, and just the basic function and right to ride a bike, which is something I do every day here. It was just really shocking and striking. So can you talk a little bit more about the systematic discrimination and how women became so pivotal in fighting for larger political freedoms in Iran?
For sure. It's a very fascinating actually concept because it's important to really ask the why questions about it and not just have a general, women are great, long live feminism. There are very structural reasons here. The basic story is that, why is Islamic Republic so misogynist? And Islamic Republic, had its own share of female founders, actually, not a lot, but there were some. It has had a complicated relationship with female activism. There were many Islamist women who came to activity with the Islamic Republic. But the basic story is that since one of the fundamental goals of the Islamic Republic is creation of what I would call like a model Islamist society, the Islamic Republic came out of a revolution. It's very important. It didn't come out of sort of a conservative movement. It came out of a revolution. And in this revolution, what you want to do in revolutions, you want to create a new world, right? You want to create a new life. One important aspect of this new life that it was to create was to build an Iranian Islamist Puritan society. And what that society would look like, it's one in which people don't need to be told even necessarily to abide by Islamic rules, but they do. And women in this view of Islamic society are maybe active citizens, but they're primarily mothers, but they're active citizens. They're certainly covering their hair. They don't look like, and this is the key fact, they don't look a lot like what women already were in 1979 in Iran. And this is important to remember. One of the first mass protests against the Islamic Republic. In fact, it happened before there was an Islamic Republic. After the revolution, before the referendum to bring back about the Islamic Republic, was on March 8th, International Women's Day. That's less than a month after the revolution, where women came out in very high numbers against the imposition of the compulsory veiling, compulsory hijab. And who are these women, Maria, who are coming out? These are women who work for Iran Air. These are women who work for the ministry. These are different ministries. No, they often work as typists, right? This is in Iran is not a sort of gender equal society in 1979. Nevertheless, there are hundreds of thousands of women who a generation ago, not unlike many countries, in the West, had a very limited life aspiration, right? Who now were working in tons of different professions. And in these new professions, they were living the lives of urban, modern women in countries around the world. That means they were dressing how they want. They were listening to what they want. They were starting to have a lifestyle that was what they wanted. They didn't want to marry at 21 and have kids all the time and, not the whole thing. But the Islamic Republic didn't want that. Now, the Islamic Republic doesn't quite want to drive women back to the home, as I would say. It has a complicated relationship here. It has female activists. It prides itself on that. But it definitely doesn't want them to look like Western women. And of course, it's not just the Islamists. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 is good to think about it in a global way, again, to get us a better understanding. The one way to think about it is that anybody who was somehow on the left in the 70s globally would have contributed to this revolution. And in the 70s in the left, there are clashing ideas and what is the place of women in society. For some, of course, there's female sexual liberation. It's later the birth control pill. There's this sort of sexual agency. But many others, they're critique leftists, right? I'm talking about leftists, in California and others. Their critique is, capitalism uses women as dolls and they're only being praised by their appearances and a true woman's worth shouldn't be in that. So all of this contributes to the Islamic Republic's agenda for women post-1979. So, it's not just Islamic reactionarism. It's also this, idea that, a woman who dresses up or whose appearance is shown is not a good thing. And there are many women who defend this, who later regret it. In the book, I talk about Homa Natek. It's a Marxist professor who very much says, it's okay, I'll wear the hijab. Hijab doesn't matter because our goal is the anti-imperialist revolution. And he very graphic language later, he says, I was wrong, right? He basically says, I was wrong. I don't know how to translate it, but in a very graphic language, he said I was wrong. So that's the story of 1979 and this imposition. Now, what happens, though, is that Iranian women never give up on the achievements that they had by 1979. You have to remember, by 1979, women in Iran have been ambassadors. They have been judges. They have been members of parliament. They've been professors. They've been university professors for decades, right? By 1979. There are people who got PhDs from University of Tehran, women, I think in 1940s, if I'm not mistaken, 40s or 50s, right? You can't tell this woman that, actually, now you have to go back and live, according to these rules. And also, in this new interpretation of rules as I had, as I said, you can't ride a bicycle, you can't smoke hookah, you can't do things that provokes men in society, allegedly. So they fight. So the reason that women have had a leading role in many movements, I would say certainly since the late 1990s, they were a cornerstone of President Khatami's reformist agenda in 1997 when he was elected. And on every sort of important socio-political movement in Iran, the women have been on the forefront. The last one being the most obvious one because it was fought in the slogan, Women, Life, Freedom. But the reason is this, there's this gap, right? This gap is that you have a society, you have a regime who wants to impose these really draconian rules on women that are unlike, the likes of which basically don't exist in most of the world. Not only most of the world, they pretty much exist nowhere except for maybe Taliban's Afghanistan, right? But you have women whose social life, whose political achievements and all that, it looks like any average European country. This gap needs to be filled somehow, and it's filled by a struggle. And it's filled by struggles large and small. So it's not just political struggles, civic society will come, but every day women in Iran are fighting for their rights in a variety of ways.
Arash, you've just compared Iran to Afghanistan, and now I'm going to compare the United States to Iran. And maybe that's ridiculous, but do you see any echoes of Iranian policy on women with this retrogressive ideas about women that are filtering through the Republican Party and other right-wing spheres in the United States right now?
Yeah, look, the idea that women should have a very defined role, and as I said, they should be primarily mothers, and that's basically it's sort of an anti-modern, anti-progressive idea, if you will. And progressive, I don't mean in sort of the political progressives. The idea is, right, it's important to really understand an idea before we oppose it, right? There's a very common idea all over the world. It exists in different forms all over the world. It's very hugely in Russia, in other places. which is to say, women have lost their place in society. The proper place is for them is to be loving wives at home, take care of the children, and they shouldn't be truck drivers. It's a very, very crude but basic idea, right? That no, society should have clear gender roles. And yeah, maybe women should have some jobs, but they shouldn't be truck drivers. I mean, I don't know. They shouldn't be, they shouldn't have so many jobs out there. And also, they shouldn't be always going on about independence. The reactionary idea is that, is very strong in incel sort of circles and stuff, right? But it comes with it is that actually modern society, liberal societies, liberal rules have empowered women at the expense of men. People believe, it's actually men who are the true victims in the societies, because they have to provide and yet they also have to be equal. And, so these are very powerful ideas, right? And yes, there are definitely similarities in ways which exist in Iran and in the US and Russia and other countries. And, what are some of the examples of this? That's why, for example, if you look at the sort of families conventions, right, which Russia supported at some point, I mean, there are Republicans and Iranians and others who go to this as sort of a family values. They're in an attempt to organize on this. An Iranian presidential candidate last year, a very hardliner presidential candidate, suggested that Iran should sort of ally with Giorgia Meloni, the right-wing prime minister of Italy, on the sort of family values question. So certainly, the Handmaiden by Margaret Atwood, I think she openly said she was inspired by the example of Iran at some point. And in Iran, this sort of Puritanist society that I said has gone the furthest, with the exception of Afghanistan. So yeah, it's definitely right to see some parallels there.
Arash, it's very interesting that you brought up Russia and this family values conventions or the traditional values, summits, and just the way that these countries, especially Russia, from what I've been reading recently, has been marketizing itself as the haven for family values. And now there's even a special visa you can get that's like a family values visa. So you get to experience the true idealized space or country for that if you go to Russia. And also the Orthodox Church is promoting all kinds of activities with American men from the right wing joining the Orthodox Church's, activities and actually becoming not believers, but followers in this whole movement. It just makes me think of the transnational nature of these, autocratic right-wing movements in general, that it's not confined to one place. It's really a lot of like synergies and learning from each other. So I was curious whether Iran is actively, I wouldn't say exporting, but maybe diffusing some of these ideas to other places. Like, are there active conventions between, say, Iran and Russia, or Iran and, other places, the Central Asian countries, where they kind of start to talk about some of these restrictions and policies in a more almost like substantive way? Like, how do you learn from Iran? Is this thing happening, or is this kind of more in a world of ideas? Like, it's sort of not learning, but maybe mimicking indirectly. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So let me say something first that, in many ways, this is very openly about subjugation of women. I mean, let's be very clear. Like, it's about subjugation of women and putting them back in their place, right? Which, if you are of a certain sort of Orthodox Church view and others, you don't like, as I said, the advances. You want to put them back in their place. And there are very sort of openly disgusting versions of that in, as I said, in sort of incel places and all that, which are, not that imaginative either. I mean, you can see what they are. But in terms of Iran and its export, it's interesting. Look, so Iran spends millions of dollars to change hearts and minds around the world, basically. It has, it runs a Press TV, which is an English language TV station. It runs Hispan TV, which is a Spanish language. It runs dozens of videos in, Azeri and Central Asian languages and, Russian and everything else. And it has tried sometimes to define itself as part of an anti-Western axis with Russia and with China. And on this question, the problem is that its rules are so extreme, its products so unpalatable, so unpopular at home, that it's just a very bad export. So it hasn't really been able to do it. Where it's more successful is on sort of foreign policy issues. So yeah, the Press TV, if you leave, I'll never forget, if you visit Birmingham, there's some average people in Birmingham, in Britain, very sort of South Asian, city, sort of huge Muslim population. Some of them look up to Press TV because of sort of this Muslim internationalism that it has, but also not just sort of people of Muslim background. Generally, let's say Press TV was a big champion of Jeremy Corbyn in his years of leadership over the Labour Party. It was a big champion of the Scottish independence, right? So basically it tries to champion anti-systemic causes in the West. And sometimes it gains some success with that. But its Achilles heel, if you will, is actually this sort of cultural issues. In fact, let me tell you something funny. It's actually opposite. It's a contradiction of the regime. If you look at press TV, it goes out of its way to show images of Tehran to say, oh, well, it's not all that Islamic either. Actually, it shows women with hijab, but they go out and they have fun. They have ice cream and they have a nightlife. So because they know such a loss, they know it's the whole, we're going to make whatever version of like Islamic model society. They know they've failed, in that so much. They do at the same time, as I said, try to offer modern versions of it. I would say they have internal debates, right? So there are people in the regime who say, look, it's ridiculous. We shouldn't have, a bicycle rule. But then they hit sort of more traditional social conservatives that are the sort of grand ayatollahs and stuff that are the heart of the regime. And I would say, I think they know that on a sort of basic cultural stuff they've lost. So they might try to change the stuff at some point. I think they understand that, on the women's issue, they've really lost in some big ways, and they create all these negative headlines and they antagonize society and they create Iranian women as their biggest enemy. So I think they understand that they need to make some changes there.
How should we think about the supreme leader? How much of the country can be thought of as a personality cult, or how important is he to the status quo? Like if he died tomorrow, what could happen?
Yeah, so Ayatollah Khamenei is pretty important. He has for very long been the most powerful man in Iran. The structure of the Islamic Republic is very strange. Ahmad Sadri, a scholar, calls it the platypus of the humanities constitutional development. It's a very strange system. The position of the supreme leader, and supreme leader is sort of a made-up English name. The actual name for this position is something like the guardian jurisprudent, which Khomeini's main inspiration for this actually comes from Plato's Republic, philosopher king, right? The idea is a cleric, will rule everything very wisely. The constitution already gives 60-70% of the power, I would say, to the supreme leader. Supreme leader has tons of positions just by the nature of being supreme leader. And the only oversight he has over his body is this assembly, who, not unlike the central committees of the communist parties in the communist systems, effectively in a communist system, supposedly it's the central committee that picks the political bureau, which picks the leader, right? So supposedly Comrade Stalin should have been accountable to this sort of central committee of the Communist Party. Effectively, the way that it works is, of course, the other way around. Stalin picks who's in the central committee. And that's basically what has happened in Iran as well. Effectively, it's Khamenei, through his control of electoral vetting bodies. There's one vetting body in particular, all of whose members are directly or indirectly appointed by Khamenei. So he gets to decide who gets to run in these elections. So all these bodies that are supposedly checks on his power are effectively shaped by him. So he's pretty powerful. I would add a couple of things, though. First of all, he's powerful, but Iran is a country of institutions. Islamic Republic is very much a country of institutions in a very interesting way. It would be interesting to compare to Russia and China. That would be you guys' job and others. I don't know how institutions always work in these countries. But, in Iran, these institutions tend to function in exactly the way they were supposed to function, right? So people get appointed and dismissed, and, they're not the rubber. There are rubber stamps in some way, but not in many ways, right? Rubber stamp is the funny way, right? So, for example, the parliament, right? The parliament in the last two elections, 2024 and 2020, were so restricted that effectively, only hardline fans of Khamenei got elected. But it still has some agency of its own, and its working matters. So the country of institutions. The other point is that Khamenei has seen such failure in some of his basic policies. Most importantly, he had, of course, famously claimed that there would be no war and Iran won't enter negotiations. No, there was both a war and Iran did enter negotiations. So he has egg on his face. And I think the fact that after these years, he brought Israeli-American attacks upon Iran, I think he lost a lot of face. And I think so in the past few months, I think we're entering the post-Khamenei era already in a way that others are vying for power so much that his role is perhaps not important. Although this is always also a bit of mystery. We really don't know how much he's calling the shots still or not. It's a very opaque. His office works in a very opaque way. And when I say we, really no one knows. If you talk to people high in powers in Iran, they still don't know. And a couple more things to say. First of all, part of the reason why we're already talking about the post-Khamenei era is that he's 86 years old. So he will die. I can talk to you in a minute about what happens where he will die. But one basic thing is that there will be a struggle for power. So that's why, we're already entering that scene. And the last point I would make here related to all of this and related to the succession issue after Khamenei is that Iranian regime has a very diverse factional life. there are different factions of the regime who want widely different things. This is one of the most important points that is often not understood. It's not often understood because it's hard to study and because it doesn't go with basic narratives, which are usually around regime, regime good, regime bad. But really inside regime, there are vastly different sort of factions. They want different things. Some want to be really close to Russia and China. Some hate Russia and China. Some want to further crack down on hijab. Some believe this is the stupidest thing you can do. Some want Iran to be the most neoliberal, openly capitalist country in the world. Some want more restrictions. And these are all different factions of the regime. So Khamenei traditionally balanced out between different factions, and that's how he kept his power, like Gaddafi in Libya, like many other leaders, like that was one of his styles. But in the last few years, you could say he very hardly went toward the hardliners. Although last year this changed because he allowed a major reformist to run in the presidential elections. And he won, Masoud Pezeshkian. So the presidency now belongs to the reformist faction, which is a faction that does favor democratization of Iran in some ways. So I think what's going to happen after Khamenei dies is that there will be a power struggle between these different factions of the regime over maybe there will be a change in the constitution and they get rid of the position of the supreme leader. Maybe they'll put a supreme leader who will be a weak supreme leader. Maybe they'll put a candidate who actually does, continue the policies that they want as supreme leader. But in my opinion, it's very unlikely for this future post-Khamenei Iran to follow the policies of Khamenei's Iran. I believe, and this is my big claim or intervention or whatever, I believe that this is why the Islamic Republic's days are up. Islamic Republic, as founded by Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979, this anti-American, anti-Israeli, socially repressive society, it's set for transformation. And I think new governing elites will come to power after Khamenei in a variety of ways. And I think their interests are not the Islamist ideals of 1979, is not sort of revolutionary anti-Westernism. It's very much more pragmatic, interest-based Iranian nationalism, I would say, actually. They want to represent Iran in some way. They understand that. Why? Because that has a much better touch with the population, right? I think as the Chinese have understood. At least this is my outsider view. So this is all a way to say that I do believe Iran is set for transformations after death of Khamenei.
And it could be without a revolutionary change. I mean, in other words, the basic political structures could remain in place and you could still have a reformist government, you think?
So to go by my own words, reformist government, no. What I'm trying to say is, in some ways, yes. So basically, after Khamenei, I believe there will be important changes in the policies of the Islamic Republic and maybe some of its structures as well. And I think, importantly, is there are continuity candidates. There are those who want to be Khamenei, version B. That's people like Mir Bagheri. If Mir Bagheri was to become supreme leader, Iran would continue along this path. I just don't think he has any chance. I think the continuity candidates are losers. They're not going to win in the power struggles in Iran because they're a bunch of morons and their policies have failed. And the thing about these guys is they're not good at anything. They're not technocrats. Haven't run anything. They're a bunch of guys, like us here, people with PhDs who know how to talk, right? So they love to talk about what a great Islamic society should be. They love to write books about Palestine. They love to do things like this. But they can't run Iran's electricity. They can't run Iran's water. And Iran is a country of 90 million, right? So what happens now is that these losers run, let's say, a cultural film festival somewhere, or they run a newspaper, or they run a TV channel. And that's easy. You show up, and they run actually the state TV, right? They run the state TV. So you show up, you say the craziest things on the state TV. The state TV in the past few months have done crazy anti-Semitic stuff, for example. Before that, they did crazy anti-Saudi stuff. It's very explosive. Just at the moment when Iran has conflicts with these countries, they do stuff like this. But so you can do that because that's just a bunch of people talking, and that's easy, right? But they can't run anything. And that's why they'll lose the power struggles. That's basically what I believe in. In 1979, people who were revolutionaries also had, acumen. They took over the country and they fought the 8 years war with Iraq and won in many ways. If they didn't win, at least they expelled Iraqis out of our country. They were able to run things because they had a serious revolutionary background and a serious revolutionary zeal, but also some charisma and some competence. And more important, they had become revolutionaries via a struggle. Many of them had studied in Berkeley and stuff, right? And they had joined because they believed in something. Whereas the current generation of pro-regime Iranians, right, these Khamenei's acolytes, are a bunch of sort of kids who've always received government favor to study for free and do trips for free and get everything for free to promote the ideologies of the government. You don't make fighters like that, right? You're not a great revolutionary if the government paid you to be a revolutionary, right? So this is the contradictions that they have. Yeah. So that's why I think they'll lose to technocrats, to nationalists, to pragmatists.
To step back and think a little bit about the role of ideology here, you talked a lot about the ideological kind of cooptation and appeal of the current government, but also its weaknesses, right? It's like there's not much there. It seems like it's kind of an empty shell at this point, and you think it's going to wane out and there's going to be this new government in place. What kind of ideological appeal would that government have potentially? What would be kind of like the building blocks of that ideology in your view? Like what would they kind of draw on to bring people in, to get more people to participate in elections, to be more active citizens, to get the country kind of on the right track? What sort of things would they draw on? Would it be economic legitimacy, performative legitimacy, or something else?
They have the best possible framework, and that's Iranian nationalism, right? They'll say, and yeah, so it has to be performance legitimacy. You asked me in the beginning, Jeremy, like, what are the problems Iranians are having? I mentioned some broad things, but perhaps I didn't mention the most obvious and important things. Iran now has electricity cuts, which is normal in, South Africa or Pakistan or, some other countries, but it wasn't normal in Iran at all, right? So now you have scheduled electricity cuts. You have scheduled water cuts. In southern Tehran, many buildings have not had water from 11 p.m. to 11 a.m., right? So these are huge performance these are sort of elements that if it continues, it gets to a failed state, right? So what would this new autocratic Iran, but, post-Khamenei, post-Islamist Iran look like? What they can do is basically they can say two things. They can say, first of all, we're Iranians. We care about Iran. Our framework is Iran. Our framework is Cyrus the Great, right? And Iranians are patriotic people, a way to connect to that, And they know Islamic Republic hasn't been that, right? Islamic Republic's whole point is Islamist internationalism. Now, it's complex. They've had to sort of piggyback on nationalist concepts. Especially in the last few months, they've done so much of that. But overall, that hasn't been their framework. So they'll know that in this way, they can get some people back. The second is performance. They're like, we can run things. Maybe you don't like that we have the political power, but look, we can run things. And also, we can run things. Remember, Maria, then what does that mean in Iranian context? It means we're not going to bother you if you're not wearing the hijab. I don't know, swimming pools can be mixed. Things that may sound small, but, will be sort of revolutionary, right? We will not interfere in your lives like that. We're going to patch up with the Western countries. So you can have the whole McDonald's come to Iran as sort of a stereotypical thing, right? So we'll do all the changes, and we're doing it for Iranian national interest. And, that would be their legitimacy basis, that there'll be sort of authoritarian Iranian nationalist government.
Arash, how deep is the anti-Americanism and the anti-Israel and or anti-Semitic feeling in Iran? Because one thing that I've always found quite curious is that the Persians that I've met outside Iran always seem to be quite pro-American. And Iran, in fact, even to this day, is really the only significant country outside the Middle East that still has a real Jewish population. And in some ways, Iran seems to be a potentially philo-Semitic country. So it's this curious, the most sort of toxic anti-Semitic and anti-American rhetoric out of the Middle East comes out of Iran, but also that doesn't really doesn't seem to match up with other things that I've observed.
Yeah, so very little anti-Americanism in Iran. In fact, very widely, including, I would say, 70-80% of people in the regime recognize that the anti-Americanism is foolish. Iran should have diplomatic relations with the US. It should stop wanting to be the anti-American country. And I think that's almost a consensus. Notice, I didn't say there was some people. I said in the regime. I think if you polled the cabinet of Masoud Pezeshkian today, the Iranian cabinet, I'll make a big claim. I think if you really polled them, like, do you think Iran should have diplomatic relationship with the United States? I think more than 90% and perhaps 100% would say yes, right? This is really what we're talking about. So this anti-American policy is driven forward by Khamenei. This is a key thing, because Khamenei is a true revolutionary of the 79 ideas. He doesn't want Iran to be successful and stuff. When you're revolutionary, your point isn't that people should, have good lives, right? It's that you should achieve some big goals, right? You should make a new man, right? So that's Khamenei. He wants a new man. He's like his open contempt for people's livelihoods. Like the very idea that people would prioritize their own well-being is something that's alien to him, right? So that's what's made sure that anti-American policy has survived. Very little person in society. Look, anti-Americanism becomes a funny term. Here, what I meant was that like people don't want Iran to follow this anti-American line that it has. No, sentiments in America, I'm sure they differ. I'm like any other society, some people don't like America because they're leftist. Some people, they might not like it because they have a more traditional Iranian nationalist narrative, actually, that is suspicious of foreign powers generally. But, these are minorities, right? I think majority are actually pro-Western in some West-facing, the term I usually use. They're very West-facing. Iranians, in fact, I'll tell you this, the other thing that I will bet on it, in the cabinet of Iran, but also in any other group of Iranians. Now ask a question. Which one Iran should be more suspicious about? America, Russia, or China? I mean, I would think America would come third in most groups. Inside the cabinet, I'm making this claim. Inside the cabinet, let alone...
And which one would be first? Is it Russia or China that's first? I'm curious.
Russia.
Russia, okay.
Russia first, and then China.
Interesting.
Because Russia is our big imperialist northern power traditionally, right? Iranians don't think in Russia in terms of Soviet Union, in terms of like the past 20 years. They think about it in the last 200 years, right? Russia is the big grand bear to our north, right? That's what Iranians sort of think when they think about Russia. And also they think that Russia and China have played Iran, basically, that they have used its vulnerability towards Western sanctions. It's not very hard to see Iran was taken for a ride by this country. Because okay, there's this big war with Israel. What are Russia and China going to do for Iran? Nothing, right? And also, are they anti-Israel? Of course they're not. Russia thinks Israel is a part of a Russophone world. Whenever someone asks me about China and Israel, I point out for them to Google China-Israel Industrial Park, which is a huge part of Israel funded by China. So basically, this sort of support for Eastern alternative to the West and all that, it has very minority support in Iran. And I think it is there. There are some Iranians who think that, perhaps more today than before. It's also because Iran is so West-facing in some embarrassing ways. I mean, where do Iranians study, including the sons and daughters of the government officials? Are they studying in China and Russia? No, mostly they are studying in the West. Iranians, frankly, are a little too embarrassingly pro-Western, actually. It's almost racist, basically, by which I mean, they sort of look up to European peoples and Western peoples. So, it's a complex thing. Iran, we are a massive civilization of our own. When we look in the world, we don't primarily think in terms of which block do we fit in. We are the central kingdom for ourselves in our own minds, right? It's a very thing that people miss. Like, Iranians don't think, are we part of the Muslim world? Are we part of a third world? No. First of all, we are Iran. I mean, Iran thinks the world begins and ends at Iran, and looks at the world from that perspective. I think it's something that a lot of people miss. And to answer your question about Israel and anti-Semitism, so again, anti-Israeli sentiment, I would say, relatively little in Iran. Traditionally, Iranians just didn't care about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the large degree. Now, there are major exceptions. I've written about it. There were Iranian groups who did solidarity with Palestinians. All of that is true. But in the last 20, 30 years, the average Iranian didn't really care about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For them, it was like Ethiopian-Eritrean conflict. I mean, it's something else that's happening somewhere else. Maybe I'll study and have an opinion on it. Maybe I'll think the Israelis are bastards for doing this. Maybe I think Palestinians are bad for doing that. But it's not a big part of their world to say, I define my political identity by what positions I take on this. This has not really been the case. And in general, I would say in Iran, there are many pro-Israeli and anti-Israeli and everything in between sort of attitudes. So in this way, Iran is akin to an average European country. And it's weird. It's like this is the kind of stuff I study. People come to support or oppose Israel for very peculiar reasons, right? So that's the case here as well. Yeah, and I would add a couple of things, is that, so in the aftermath of the 12-day war, there are obviously new anti-Israeli sentiments. Unfortunately, now there's a reality, is that there are now thousands of Iranians, probably tens of thousands, who know someone who was killed by Israel. It's no longer you can say this is something we don't care about. Oh, Israel? Oh, yes, that's the one who killed my cousin, right? And also Israel, because of the last 2 years, because of the genocide in Gaza, because of the sort of activities that Israel has done in the region, the way that attacked Syria, the way that countries, there's obviously a lot of more negative feelings about it in this way. But again, not in a way that, Iran should do something about it. So people might say, Israel is terrible, what they're doing is terrible, but not to endorse the Iranian government's sort of line of destruction of Israel, or to believe this is something that Iran should do. And the question of anti-Semitism. So yes, Iran is the only country in the Middle East, if you don't count Turkey in the Middle East. It has the largest Jewish population, which is a striking fact, because it has the very openly anti-Semitic, anti-Israeli government. And yet something between 10 to 30,000 Iranian Jews continue to live there. And I don't even like the way I phrased it just now, continue to live there, because because very interesting. You ask Iranian Jews, why are you living there? It's like, why are you stay here? And, basically they'll ask, why are you living there? I mean, there's like, it's our home. We've always lived here. The default is that we're here. Now, yes, things are tough here and there. The Iranian Jews are also the only Mizrahi group, majority of whom don't live in Israel, right? So most Iranian Jews actually live in the United States. So when they could leave, they didn't leave for Israel. And there's a beautiful new book about Iranian migration to Israel by Ali Azadiyar. I've reviewed it for the next issue of Iranian Studies. For those who are, academic nerds who are interested in such things. It's a very sort of interesting and peculiar topic for me to focus on this a little. So the Iranian government is a big purveyor of anti-Semitism of different forms. It's Holocaust denial. The Iranian state TV has broadcast songs in last few months, who says, let's uproot all the Jews. I mean, very directly anti-Semitic. Of course, it supports the Houthis who say, damn the Jews on their banner. The state TV showed this really hideous sort of music video of sorts, which shows like a typically Jewish-looking man on a beach, trying to learn to swim. And the joke of this thing is that, Jews should learn how to swim because they have to flee Israel, which is something that military leaders of Iran has said before. So this is what its government does. On the societal level, again, I think, yes, there's anti-Semitism, there's growing anti-Semitism in different parts. But I think it's comparable to, again, in many ways, a European society. I wish, there are some anti-Semites, there are some philo-Semites, there's everything in between, right? But also, the experience of Jews in Iran is important. I'll say a couple of things very quickly about that. First of all, I think a lot of Iranians, I would say even most Iranians, or many Iranians, maybe not most Iranians today, but very large number of Iranians at some point have met a Jewish person in their life. I mean, inside Iran. So, I had a Jewish classmate, like in high school. Right. And I think if you live in Tehran, that's almost inevitable. You'll have a Jewish classmate at some point, Iranian Jewish classmate. So you'll have a very different experience. I would say that in recent times, because of this pro-Israeli TV broadcasts, a lot of people sort of feature Iranian Israelis. So those Iranians who do live in Israel, Iranian Jews who live in Israel, they show the Iranian Jewish history more linked to Israel in some ways, which I think has complicated consequences. Yeah, but as a whole, I would say it horrifies me to see new forms of anti-Semitism. And this is an interesting topic of research. New forms of anti-Semitism linked to the war in Gaza. Like I saw someone the other day just posting very open blood libel, saying, oh, did you know that Jews as part of their ritual is to kill kids? And they've been gone to the court in all these countries around the world. And it's interesting. Someone was pushing this. He got a lot of pushback from including sort of very anti-Israeli Iranian folks. They use interesting arguments. They're like, oh no, this is actually Christian anti-Semitism. It has nothing to do with us. Why are you doing this with us? And,
wrong anti-Semitism.
There are some Iranians, some anti-Israeli Iranians who are like similar to the average anti-Zionist on a Western campus, right? The average anti-Zionist on a Western campus, we can have our debates about what they are, but they're not going to deny the Holocaust or say the blood libels were actually true. So, they use another language, which I find problematic in other ways, but there are different kinds. What I'm really trying to say is that Iran is part of the world, right? Our job is to explain how it's complicated. It's complicated. Iran is part of the world, and different forms of anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist discourses have entered Iran and will continue to move. They want to sort of throw other countries under the bus, right? But nothing on the level that, in somewhere like Egypt would exist, let's say, because of a very different relationship that it has had with Israel and with Jews, right? And, Iran would always have, as I said, these diversities of you have then rabidly sort of pro-Israel people who are pro-Israel for different reasons, because they're so pro-Western, for example, that they'll support anyone. They're so anti-Islamic. And this is the other thing. Iranians are huge Islamophobes. A lot of Iranians are very anti-Islam. They think that what is wrong with the world is primarily Islam, right? So, of course, they're going to support, Israel in that way. So, Iran is very complicated and diverse in that way.
Yeah, I love the way you illuminate these contradictions, of which are, of course, pertinent to any complex, big, ancient country. It makes sense that there are so many different strands of society and perspectives that are at times appear as if in conflict with each other, but also it's very sensible, right? And we have to unpack these layers and not to assume that there is one or the other narrative dominating. And from there, we can kind of travel to another context, which is also very complex and contradictory, which is here, the United States, where you've been living now for a while, right? Since 2017, if I'm not mistaken, Arash?
That's right.
And in an Atlantic piece you wrote a little while ago since Trump's election about liberal Americans despairing about U.S. politics since the election. In that piece, you appeared a bit more hopeful. You write that, quote, "The country has always been a big, beautiful land of contradictions, end of quote. Big and beautiful, are two words that have come to be used in a certain way under Trump as well. Do you still feel the beauty? Do you still feel this statement kind of resonating with you, and how?
Yeah, I wrote that on the day after Trump's election, actually. I think actually I wrote it in the night of Trump's election. It was like published the day after. It was my initial reaction. Well, I think it was too late when we found out Trump was elected. So it was November 8th, I think, the day after the election. Yes, I do feel that. Look, here is where I take a grand sort of historical view. The United States, what I tried to say there was this actually, that, United States under Trump fits a certain mold of anti-American ideas very well. Now, Europeans like to imagine America as a place of sort of big, bashful place where everybody is like fat and eats, a lot of burgers and hates everybody. And I think that does injustice to this guy. So in this way, Trump really fits this idea, right? Big, imperialistic, bashful, and he revels in it. I mean, he wants to be McKinley, I think. He wants United States to be a very traditional imperialist country where it doesn't give a shit about anyone and goes around the world. What I try to say is that America really always has been a big, beautiful land of contradictions because, this country doesn't fit easy narratives. There I mentioned some very small things, like I mentioned public libraries. The United States is generally not a place where public services are good. Yet, show me another country with public libraries, like the United States has. You can go to a suburb in Indianapolis and see a public library that will probably have books in like Urdu, right? The United States has a capacity for diversity, for example, which has driven a lot of us to this country, a lot of us, or our parents, or, in my very recent, as you said, yes, like, why do we come to America? That's a good question. Why do we come to America? I think we come to America because, and what do I mean by this sort of capacity for diversity? I basically mean that people from different parts of the world have traditionally had an opportunity to come to America and do really grand things. I know it sounds something like simple, but it isn't. And this doesn't matter just on the level of, well, this means that, it's the land of immigrants and, we can all hold hands, or this is why we came here. Where's my American dream? It's not that. It's that this is how this country has gotten shaped historically, right? It's how it's gotten shaped historically. So that's why the idea that it should be sort of an Anglo-Saxon, vast country is so alien. I mean, and, goes against the history of this country. It's not sort of optimism. It's a recognition that the pendulum can go back and forth. And in America, it's forever. This is the other wonderful thing about this country. It's forever a work in progress, right? It's a project, not a country in many ways, right? It's a country whose founders really founded it on the back of a grand historical revolution and wanted it to be a land of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness.
On the pursuit of happiness, I mean, it sometimes seems to me that the pursuit of happiness takes the place of everything else. And one of the very concerning things about contemporary American politics and life is the onset of apathy and lack of interest in politics. And you've written about the low turnout rates for elections in Iran, which is not that different from here. The turnout rates, despite the fact that the American politics occupies the oxygen of every media operation around the world, the turnout rates for elections are surprisingly low. Do you see apathy, especially amongst younger people, as a transnational trend? And what can we do to change that if that's the case?
I definitely see it as a transnational trend. It's a pernicious trend. As someone who is very unhappy about, a lot of things in the world, not just the obvious things, but some of the bigger trends that go beyond sort of immediately not liking certain policies. I mean, one of it is the deprioritization of politics. I think what has happened is that following the fall of the Soviet Union, that's where I usually like to draw. Following the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, the vision of the world given to people around the world was this end of history. That, politics is over. You don't have to fight for a different vision of society. All you need to do is like, neoliberalism, right? All you need to do is work on yourself, improve yourself, right? Your own career, your own life, your own individuality, and get things, gather things and get things. And around the world is going in one direction. All the walls are coming down. And it was true in some ways. I mean, in some limited ways, it was true. I'm someone who thinks end of history of Fukuyama had a lot of truth to it, actually. There was not a lot of ideological rivals to capitalism. But the effect that it had was that it's killed politics. Because why would you show up to vote if there's nothing at stake, right? The average Western democracy had become, and this is the point that the Slavoj Žižek, the Marxist philosopher, made a few times, the average Western democracy had become in which a center-left party and a center-right party saying effectively the same thing. They agreed on 90% of the things. Maybe they disagreed on, whether the taxes should be 17% or 14%. That's not what brings people. Why should they come to vote where no real difference is given? And of course, what Zizek predicted, and did become true, is that then you're going to get people who will give this stuff for people to vote for, but it's not going to be things that you like. It's going to be blood and soil nationalism. It's going to be really sort of reactionary misogynist thing. It's going to be, right? They're going to bring passion back to politics by these far-right ideas. And it's interesting, it's been mostly far-right ideas, this phenomenon of populism. The left, including the far left, the communist parties, the socialist parties, the new left parties like Podemos in Spain, they really failed to win big in this game. And I think the reason is that the kind of anti-systemic revolt, that people call populism, really worked better with this result to some tribalism. And that's how it organized people. And the left can't really do that, tribalism. Unfortunately, it doesn't even try to do it on patriotism, which I think is a good form of tribalism. I think, if you organize a left-wing party in the United States, it should be all around how beautiful and great and lovely America is. And, if it's a great country, it should provide healthcare for its citizens. But yeah, so basically what I think happened was that politics was made redundant by elite consensus on a very large number of things that made sort of politically demobilized people. I should also add that I think, again, left politics, so I said the neoliberal version, but left politics also had a terrible role and has a terrible role in this, because what happens is that the old left traditions of old left communist parties, socialist parties, before the 1960s and 50s, these are parties that really organized people all over, and they wanted them to sort of work toward very modest goals, but in a mass movement. So the point of being a communist was that you were part of a mass movement, right? You were part of a trade union, you were part of a mass movement, and you were trying to change things. And, communism sounds like a scary, but if you look at communist parties in the Western countries, a lot of time they were doing pretty much social democratic things, like running governments, like in places like Italy or Spain, like running municipal governments. Whereas the kind of version of new leftism that you get out of the 60s and 70s, it's all about performativity. It's all about radicalism to no end. It's all about how you want to prove, you are better than everybody. That's not going to work in politics, right? Because, you cannot organize people. So a contradiction here is that a lot of people who are critiques of policies are anti-political in their behavior, right? So they don't encourage people to vote because they have nothing to vote for, because they believe electoral politics is bad and they don't like politicians, as they say. It's just an immediately idiotic thing to say. You don't like politicians because politicians are not all the same, right? So they are also quite widely different. And I think it's a very major plague on Western societies and Western democracies that people are not active in politics. And I'll tell you what it ends to is that there will be no one left to defend democracy, right? Why do you care about democracy? If you believe elections don't matter, and if you believe all politicians are the same, why care for democracy? And I think it's a very, very scary reality that very huge numbers of people in the United States particularly, but also in some other Western countries, are not Democrats anymore. They don't believe in democracy. From the far left or the far right, they don't believe in basics of democracy.
Bit of a pessimistic scenario for sure.
Well, it's an existing plague, but it's not the only one. So we can fight against it.
Yeah. So at the end, are there a couple of strategies that you would recommend in terms of fighting against it? Especially for listeners who are not, academics or, they're not working in the sector, just educating or writing about these issues.
I think it should all be political. I mean, that's a very important point, is to be all political. First of all, not just vote everywhere, but get politically active in different parts. Join a political organization. Join your political meetings somewhere.
At the local level, yeah, anywhere.
Local level. And don't forget that politics is the key to changing the world, right? It's the key.
As much as we can be cynical, it still is the key.
It's the key, right? Yeah. And you need to defend democratic norms,
Right. Yeah, the kind of awakening towards engagement. Moving towards the last question, thinking about migration here and where we are, our positions in this world and in this tumultuous moment of political change. You've been unable to return to Iran since you left for Canada with your family, right? And then to the United States, you haven't been able to go back from the US or Canada back to your home country. Some Americans are now talking about leaving. A few prominent professors, I'm sure you've read about, have already taken jobs in Canada. What do you say to these people who are mentioning this idea of movement, leaving, becoming voices in diaspora? What are some opportunities and pains of living in exile that you can share with us? And do you recommend or suggest to people in the States who are critical, who are fed up with the current regime, just to leave, to go elsewhere?
I mean, obviously, it's not comparable. If I go back to Iran, I will be put into jail for a very long time with no accountability. Thankfully, that's not the case in the US. Now, people might still lose their jobs. They might have certain troubles. At some point, unfortunately, we might get unfair prosecutions. But we're not anywhere like the Iran's level. I would say, so exile from Iran and exile from the United States are two different things, are too different to be compared. But yeah, one answer is no. I think I don't recommend it. I think if you want to play a political role in your country, you should stay there and you should fight to change it there. For someone like me and for others, exile can sometimes be a useful thing. We've been a terrible exiled community, Iranians, in terms of politically being the most shameful, useless exiled community you could possibly have had. Now, many people will think otherwise, like, oh no, but the Iranians come out and they organize these beautiful demonstrations outside. None of it means anything because Iranians have not been able to do the one thing that we could have done, which is organize political movements, political parties, political organizations outside because we're free to do it. There are millions of Iranians abroad. We could have done it. We haven't done it. Had we done it, we could have changed the history of Iran. I mean, I'm very clear on that. We haven't done it. By and large, we haven't done it. Myself and others have been part of many failed efforts in that regard. Why? Part of it has to do with that political demobilization we talked about. It's actually directly that. We haven't done it because guess what? If a young American doesn't want to vote, well, a young Iranian doesn't want to join a political organization either because we've not been told that capital P politics is the way to change the world. One thing that boils my blood, I always see it. Someone would say something. There was an Iranian artist who said, joining a political party is beneath an artist. It's a very typical sort of thing to say for people. And how stupid it is because politics is organization of society as you live in it. To join a political party means you want to have a role in organizing your society. And you think it's beneath you because partisan activity gets a bad name, right? Basically, you're power hungry. But that's not the case. It's a civic duty. So yes, Iranians have been terrible in exile. So I don't think we are in a position to give, advice to anybody else in this regard. But I would say that if you look at the history of American exiles, we have people like James Baldwin, who went to Paris, of course, during the 60s and all that. And yeah, you can have a role as sort of an intellectual. You can sort of use that distance from your country to speak about certain things and have a role. But if you're talking about political change in the United States, if you're talking about meaningful engagement with the U.S. society, you got to be there.
Oh, thank you so much, Arash. It was an incredibly insightful conversation, interview, and also very inspirational to think about our positions, our roles, what to do in the next steps, short-term, long-term. And yes, staying put is one of the lessons I'm getting out of this as well.
Of course. Thank you so much.
The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Maria Repnikova.
And me, Jeremy Goldkorn. The show is edited by Kadra Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed in the Guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymno Pidi No. 1, arranged and performed also by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei.
Please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Leave us a review. And if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletters. Thank you.
Thank you, Arash.
Thank you so much. It was great to be with you guys. Thank you.